Okay, guys, here we are on the digestive system, and this is a little bit of a long lecture, so it'll have several pieces. This first piece, I'm going to talk about a general overview of the GI tract. We'll talk about the different layers that they're called tunics, and then we'll go into the specific organs along the GI tract, and then we'll talk about some of the accessory organs, teeth, the liver, and the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Okay, so when I say GI tract, GI stands for gastrointestinal tract. Gastro means stomach, and then intestinal is referring to the intestines, and there are two intestines, the small intestine and the large intestine. It is important that you understand the order of the organs that the food will pass through. So oral cavity down to the esophagus takes the food to the stomach. Then you go into the small intestine first, so small first, and then into the large intestine, and then out through there. Okay, then we'll also talk about some of the teeth, the salivary glands, the gallbladder, liver, and pancreas. Okay, so let's start with a serous membrane review. You've heard all of these words before, but I do want you to know them specifically in the context of the digestive system. If we are in the abdominal cavity, what would be the name of the serous membrane that directly lines the organs themselves? That would be the visceral peritoneum. So remember, visceral means it's on the organ itself, and then peritoneum is referring to the organs that are found in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so these are the visceral peritoneum right on the organ itself. Okay, and all serous membranes are paired. So there's another one, which is the parietal peritoneum. And the parietal peritoneum is going to be on the body wall. So this green line right here. So it lines the entire cavity wall here. Okay. And so if you look into a cadaver, this is generally what it kind of looks like. So what they've done in this picture right here is the skin is removed, obviously, and then here is the muscle. If you cut through the muscle and then reflect back the abdominal muscles here, so this would be the rectus abdominis right there. So cut right through the middle of that and reflect them back. You're going to see a shiny layer on the inside here. So this shiny layer lining the inside of the abdominal muscles, that would be the parietal peritoneum. And then the shiny layer that's on the organs themselves, that would be the visceral peritoneum. Okay, so what we're looking at in this picture, would be the large intestine. Over here would be the small intestine. We also have a couple of specialized membranes. And remember that the function of the peritoneum, the serous, this parietal and visceral peritoneum, is to secrete serous fluid, and that helps lubricate and reduce friction so that it moves around. So like as you're doing an abdominal twist, for example, those organs are sliding past one another. Now we have a couple of specialized membranes. You've seen these before as well. First we have the greater omentum. And the greater omentum is an apron of membrane. What I mean by that is that it comes down, it kind of makes a little loop, and then it goes back up. Okay, so what it does is it's a little flap of a membrane that's only found in the anterior, which means it's only covering the front of the abdomen, and it's filled with fat. And that anytime you see yellow stuff here, all that yellow stuff, that is loose adipose connective tissue, which means that it is fat tissue. So fat tissue will be yellow. And so you have this apron of fat, and what it does is it goes and it covers those intestines, and it protects them from shock absorption, right? So if you get punched in the stomach, that'll protect your organs just a little bit. Okay, so notice that there's no bones in the abdomen. There's no rib cage there, and so instead you're protecting it with the greater omentum. And the second one is the mesentery, and the mesentery is the window-like membrane that attaches the intestines to the back wall. So what you're looking at in this picture here is if you take the small intestine, which would be this tube right here, that's the small intestine, and if you kind of pull it outwards, behind it, anchoring it to the back wall, this would be the mesentery. And you, in this picture here, you see yellow and red. The yellow is a vein. It's called the hepatic portal system, and what it does is it takes nutrient-rich blood, so nutrients that just came off of the small intestine, it's going to travel to the liver first for filtering there. So that's a hepatic portal vein there. And then you have the red one, and the red one we would see would be the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Hopefully you remember those terms. Okay, so this whole structure, the membrane itself would be the mesentery, and it has blood vessels embedded in the membrane. Okay, so we'll start with the GI tract, and for this first lecture piece, I just want to go over the different layers of the GI tract, and these layers are found in all of the GI tracts, so this is sort of generalized, and those layers are called tunics. So usually they have the word tunica or something similar. And tunics just means layer, that's all it means. So we have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, usually it's muscularis externa, and the serosa. So I'll start off with the mucosa. The mucosa is the innermost layer, so it would be the one that is in contact with where the food would be. The empty space inside of the intestine is called the lumen. So the mucosa would be the innermost one that is right next to the lumen of the intestine and the stomach. That's true as well. And this is the location where you would find things like villi and microvilli, especially in the small intestine. So here is the villi here. That's just an extension of the mucosa, like a finger-like extension that goes down. This would be where the lumen would be. And microvilli are the small little structures that you can see, the brush border you may have seen for when we went through the tissues, that comes off the surface of the cells that line the tissue. Okay, so that would be the innermost layer, and that's the one that includes things like villi and microvilli that help increase that surface area. We're going to revisit villi and microvilli when we get to the small intestine. Okay, let's talk about some tissues. Almost all of the GI tract is going to be lined with simple columnar epithelium. You do need to know that. Most of the GI tract is lined with a simple columnar epithelium here. Remember, simple means one layer. Columnar means column shape, so more like rectangles. There's the nucleus. See, there's space sitting on top of the nucleus. That means that these are columnar cells, and surfaces are always lined with epithelial tissue. Okay, remember here is a goblet cell. Do you remember what goblet cells secrete? They secrete mucus. We also saw those goblet cells in the respiratory tract lining the trachea in this pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay, so almost all of it is going to be found. Almost all of the GI tract has simple columnar epithelium. There are some exceptions, for example, the esophagus. We'll talk about more when we get there. Okay, so you have the simple columnar epithelium here. That'll be the innermost layer, so what would be in contact with the food, and there's the lumen right there, there's the surface. Then you have the lamina propria. The lamina propria is just the connective tissue that connects the epithelium to the underlying tissue here. That's going to be made up of loose areolar connective tissue. And then you have just a very small little layer of smooth muscle here. That's called the Muscularis mucosae. Please don't confuse that with the muscularis layer. So the Muscularis externa, that is down here. This is just a very thin layer that's part of the mucosa. That's why it's mucosae. So the Muscularis mucosae is a very thin layer, smooth muscle that's still part of the mucosa. So different from the muscularis. Okay, next one, sub. What does the prefix sub mean? Like a subfloor? It's underneath, right? So the submucosa is underneath the mucosa, and this is the vascular region. So if you look at this picture here, what you're looking at is the submucosa. That's where you're going to find things like glands, you'll find blood vessels, you'll find a whole network of nerves, a bunch of nerve plexus, and so all the kind of good stuff kind of hangs out in there, sort of like the dermis of the skin. So the submucosa is this area right here, and that's going to be made up of mostly loose areolar connective tissue. Okay, so here we are in the Muscularis externa. So what would be the tissue type that makes up the Muscularis externa? So it can't be, it's a muscle, because there it is right in the name, and it can't be cardiac muscle because cardiac muscle is only found in the heart, and it can't be skeletal muscle because skeletal muscle, it creates movement by pulling on the skeleton. So it has to be smooth muscle. And I do want you to know that most of the GI tract has 2 layers of smooth muscle. You have an internal circular layer here. Okay, so this would be where the submucosa is. Next to that is the circular layer there, and then you have the longitudinal layer, and longitudinal means lengthwise. Okay, so you have a circular layer going around the circumference, around the outside like a circle. Then you have the longitudinal layer, which means it'll travel lengthwise along the organ here. And then in the stomach only, so stomach only, then you have a 3rd layer, which is called the oblique layer. And oblique means at an angle. Okay, so you'll have that additional layer, and we'll talk more about why the stomach has an extra layer when we get to the stomach. Most of the GI tract only has a circular layer and a longitudinal layer, and that's how you help move the food through the GI tract. That's called peristalsis. So peristalsis is the process of moving the food through the GI tract. So you have the circular layer to squeeze it like a sphincter, then you have the longitudinal layer to push it along. That's peristalsis. Okay, last one, serosa. The serosa is the same layer as the visceral peritoneum, and all serous membranes are made up of the same 2 tissues. You've got simple squamous epithelium, so 1 layer of very flat cells. That's why you can barely see it. Simple squamous epithelium, because remember, here is another surface, and then underneath that, connecting it to the muscularis externa, then you would have the loose areolar connective tissue right in here. So this makes up the same layer as the visceral peritoneum. Okay, and that's just to help bind everything together and protect everything. Okay, remember, it creates that serous fluid that helps increase lubrication and allows you to move around without damaging your tissues. Okay, so take a minute right now, go ahead and pause it and see if you can figure out which one does each of these 6. Okay, so let's go through it together. So which one moves food through the GI tract? If it's moving, it has to have muscle. So it's the one that will be made up of smooth muscle, and that would be the muscularis externa. Okay, muscularis externa, that's the one that has the circular layer and the longitudinal layer to create peristalsis. Which one has villi and microvilli? So villi are extensions, finger-like extensions into the lumen. Which layer is in contact with the food? Which one goes into the empty space, the lumen? That would be the mucosa. Which one includes elaborate glands? So if you have glands, they're all going to be found in the submucosa. The same is true for the nerve plexus and the blood vessels. Which one is primarily smooth muscle? We already answered that one here. That would be the same as this one. That's the muscularis externa. Which one includes simple columnar epithelium? So if we're an epithelium, the epithelium would be at a surface, and so we've got 2 choices. Is it the serosa or the mucosa? The mucosa is the one that's going to be lined with simple columnar epithelium for almost all. Again, there's a couple organs that are an exception. Which one is the same as the visceral peritoneum? that would be the serosa. So the serosa is a serous membrane. That's where that comes from. Okay, so that's enough for this lecture piece. For the next lecture piece, I'll start going through the individual organs as we go through.